Stephen Conn is the W.E. Smith Professor of History at Miami University of Oxford, Ohio. He is the author of such books as The Lies of the Land, Seeing Rural America for What It Is and Isn't, Americans Against the City, Anti-Urbanism in the 20th Century, and Nothing Succeeds Like Failure, The Sad History of American Business Schools. He's also the author of many articles, reviews, and essays. Additionally, Steve is the founding editor of the online magazine Origins, Current Events in Historical Perspective, and its spin-off publication, Picturing Black History, which is a collaboration with Getty Images. Steve has lectured all over the country and around the world, and tonight we have the very special treat of hosting him here at the Center for Global Humanities. Please join me in welcoming Stephen Conn for his lecture, Demystifying Rural America. Thanks so much. You got it.
Thank you for that, Josh, and thank you all for coming out this evening on this brisk and invigorating late fall day. The first thing I would like to do is to ask you all, please, to admire this really handsome UNE tie, which Josh just gave to me. Now, Josh didn't, as a gift for being here, he didn't know that it was, in fact, my birthday today. And so thank you, Josh, very much for this terrific birthday gift. My task for you, according to the slide, is to demystify rural America. And in fact, Josh mentioned what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about this book I did. It came out about a year ago, which, The Lies of the Land, Seeing Rural America for What It Is and Isn't. And if there's a single takeaway I would ask you to draw from this book, it's that books make terrific gifts. Everybody loves a book for the holidays. This book is what happens when somebody who identifies himself professionally as an urban historian decides to look at the places around him and attempt to make some sense of them. I now live in a very small town in southwest Ohio, which is surrounded by corn and soybean fields, and I teach in a university which is in a slightly larger town, also surrounded by soybean and cornfields. And as I go through these spaces all the time over the last several years, it occurred to me I ought to figure out what's going on here, and I didn't really know. The book that I wound up writing is not the book I intended to write. I thought when I sat down to do this, I was going to dig deep and find the historical roots of what was being talked about all the time in the press, in the newspapers, magazines, on the radio, and whatnot, crisis. The crisis of rural America, crisis and all of its synonyms. That seemed to be, at an almost relentless pace, everything what we were saying about rural America, and that's, I thought I was gonna dig into that and sort of get to the bottom of all of that. But what happens when you go into a historical research project is that the sources that you go to look at tell you something else is going on. And so and this has actually happened with every book I've ever written. I thought I was going to do one thing, I take a sharp left turn, and we wind up in some other destination. And that's what happened here. What I began to realize was that part of what the discourse about rural America is trapped in it is really rooted in a very elaborate and long-standing mythology about what we mean when we use the word rural. For convenience sake, I'm going to blame it on Thomas Jefferson, though he is not at all the only person in the late 18th century. But what Jefferson encapsulates, and does so quite articulately in many of his writings, is that, as he puts it, farmers are the most valuable citizens. What Jefferson begins to do is to take rural existence and pile on a whole series of almost moral values on top of it. They're the most vigorous people. They are tied to the country and wedded to its liberty. you thought you were just a farmer, but in fact, you've now got the burden of all of this, of the republic itself, on your shoulders. Now, Josh didn't mention, but I'm originally from Philadelphia, and I am therefore legally obligated to talk about Benjamin Franklin every time I give a public address. But let me just note here that Franklin was a pretty good citizen. He was a pretty valuable citizen. And indeed, in his autobiography, I would argue, he invents the notion of what an American citizen is. Franklin spent his entire life in urban spaces, never once lived out in the countryside. You know, of course, he left Boston at the age of 17, spent his life in Philadelphia, but shuttled back and forth between Philadelphia, London, and Paris. I wondered what Franklin would have thought when he read Jefferson's invocations of the virtue of cultivators and whatnot. But what Jefferson describes, and again, he's not the only one, I'm picking on him for convenience sake, really becomes a kind of cultural ideal at the turn of the 19th century and then across the rest of that century. You see our yeoman farmer there on the right of the slide. The lithograph, the print that you're seeing on the left, which is again about 1798, something like that, I think captures the way in which rural people, and mostly farmers now we're talking about, have risen simply beyond people who grow things or raise things, right? It says here in the slide, venerate the plow. And venerate is not respect it, not admire it, but to venerate it. And venerate, of course, is a word we associate with a religious practice, right? And so this is the level at which now people have begun to talk about rural people. What's ironic here, or maybe not ironic, maybe it's exactly, maybe we should exactly have expected it, is that this notion of veneration is promoted largely by middle-class writers, critics, theologians, and others who aren't themselves part of a rural economy, aren't themselves part of rural life, but imagine that this is what it ought to be like. The image you see here is a Currier and Ives print. Now, you all know Currier and Ives, and there's the homestead there, and it's all cozy, and the smoke's coming out of the chimney, and the chickens are running around in the front. But Currier and Ives is an enormous printing operation in the mid-19th century New York, selling these kinds of prints to other middle-class people in New York and Boston and Philadelphia so they can hang them in their thoroughly urban parlors and say, ah, yes, there's the homestead. We see this in the 19th century in writings, in imagery, but the problem is it doesn't at all reflect American reality. The graph you're looking at here is a graph of the urbanization of the American population. So on the left-hand side of the graph, we're at 1790, which is the first time we count ourselves under the new constitutional census. And the far right-hand side of the graph is 2010. So it's not exactly, we didn't hit the last census on this graph. What you're seeing in the blue is the urban population. And what you're seeing in the green is the rural population. And you can see that that graph line is more or less uninterrupted across more than 200 years of American history. So even as Jefferson insisted that we should all be a nation of yeoman farmers, people nodded their heads and they applauded and they ran to the city. That's what they did across the 19th century, across the 20th century, and indeed it continues today. Now, I'll take a brief pause to say in the middle of the 20th century, the Census Department started counting things a little differently. So we now have an urban count, but we also have what is called a metropolitan statistical area, which sort of incorporates a city and its surrounding suburbs. And so with that in mind, nowadays, between 75 and 80% of Americans live in a metropolitan statistical area of more than 100,000 people. That's the urbanization of the population. Again, despite all of the invocations of rural virtues and the importance of yeoman independence. I love this image here because, again, it captures some of this, let's say, contradiction, this conundrum about what we are as a people and what we believe we are as a people. The image you're looking at here was painted by the Philadelphia painter Thomas Hovenden. It was painted in 1893, and it's called Breaking Home Ties. What you see here is that story, right? It's dripping with sentimentality. There's mom sending her son off from the country farmhouse, off into the big wide world. He's going to go make his fortune in the big city. Breaking home ties. The reason I love this image is not simply for its sentiment, but because it was exhibited at the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago, where it won first prize among American paintings. So it captured, again, what Americans wanted to believe about our lives, about our society, even as that was no longer true. And the turn of the 20th century is where it's no longer debatable what kind of a society we are. It's in the 1890s that the value of manufactured products, the things coming out of factories, exceeds the value of agricultural products for the first time. And of course, that will continue. By 1920, the Census Department will report that a majority of Americans now live in cities. And it's in this period, right around the turn of the 20th century, that we become, sort of decisively an urban society. So you might think here in the early 20th century, we would reassess these mythologies. But in fact, we don't. We double down on them. You may recognize the man here. If you don't, it is Henry Ford, behind a plow. Henry Ford, who invented, of course, the modern automobile culture with its factory production and everything that it would do to the landscape and the countryside and so forth, was deeply rooted in this 19th century sentimental notion of what Americans should be and the values of rural life and rural living. So here he is as an old man hitching up the horses to a plow, and I mean, this is nonsense, right? This is a photograph that he wanted to present to himself. He was never a farmer. He was always a mechanic, and then of course he was a robber baron. But it's at about this moment, right around the First World War, that he embarks on his last great project. And just a quick show of hands, this is Greenfield Village in Dearborn, Michigan, which is where Ford's big plant was, the River Rouge plant, and it's just adjacent, a little bit south of Detroit. Anybody been to Greenfield Village? Okay. So Greenfield Village is an extraordinary place. It is a completely ersatz place. It is a place invented entirely out of Henry Ford's imagination. What you come through the gates, and of course you drive into the gates. I mean, it is Henry Ford after all. So when you drive into the gates and you walk onto this piece of property, what you see is a completely invented 19th century small town. And each of the buildings at Greenfield Village was originally sited someplace else, and Henry Ford bought it because he liked it, put it on the back of a train car, and moved it to Greenfield Village, and then dropped it down to create, as you can see, a grid of streets and a church and houses and all of this. So here's his monument to the 19th century world of rural small towns that he himself had done a great deal to destroy. That's the wonderful irony about Greenfield Village. The very first building he purchased as this idea was percolating was his own one-room schoolhouse, which was about to be torn down for a road widening project. Because the irony is just too rich. So here's Henry Ford and his project. And then maybe most famously of all, this doubling down on our rural mythologies. You all read these books. You read them to your kids. You read them to your grandkids. The Little House on the Prairie series, which the first book, Little House in the Big Woods, I think, is the first one, published in 1932, and I think the last one was published in 1943, that run through the 1930s. And these are immensely popular books. They've never been out of print. They remain immensely popular books. But what are these books really about? They're about a now older woman looking back nostalgically at her own childhood out there on the frontier in the 19th century. That's not the American world anymore, but it appeals to Americans. Clearly, it resonates in ways that are profound for Americans and American children. Of course, you all know, especially those of you of a certain age, that this is also made into a TV series. It ran from the early 1970s into the early 1980s. So there is this ongoing, long-standing, deeply rooted mythological notion about what life out in the countryside is all about. And what I would argue to you, and I would enjoy debating this with you in our time for questions and answer, is that this rural mythology has, in fact, evolved into something of a political ideology. And I want to describe just a little bit what I mean by that. The first part of this ideology is the notion that Americans are or ought to be rugged individuals. The quote you see here is from another one of these urban intellectuals pronouncing about rural ways of life. Patrick Quinn, in 1940, agriculture is an individual way of life. Urban life is cooperative. And unlike what you may have learned in kindergarten, in this quote, cooperation is bad. What's good is being out there by your own, right? And so the tropes of individualism, of that rugged individualism, remain, I think, central to at least some definitions of what it means to be an American. Likewise, independence and self-sufficiency. That's what rural life is supposed to entail, and that's what Americans are supposed to embody. It's what's used all the time, at least in certain political quarters, to explain why we don't have the same kind of social welfare state that you might find, say, in Scandinavia or most of Western Europe, because Americans, after all, are self-sufficient. And there's Gary Cooper facing it all down by himself at high noon. And the third piece of this is that the rural posits itself in opposition to large government. Sometimes that means state government, but mostly it means the federal government. That there is this natural antipathy that rural people have to the federal government, and, go back to Jefferson, we should all be suspicious of the federal government, and that therefore rural people stand as a force against the encroachment of an increasingly powerful, overreaching state in this country. Take this together, these three little bits, and I think this is what, again, for some people on one end of the political spectrum, this is what it means to be a real American. You'll recognize this quote. It seems so long ago. 2008, Sarah Palin giving a speech. It's October of 2008 in a relatively small town, I think in North Carolina. I should also just say offhandedly, a more or less all-white town, that this is where real America resides. Even though, right, look at those numbers, real Americans actually, statistically speaking, reside in a suburb of Chicago. That's where Americans are, and yet here we are with a vice presidential candidate more or less repeating something that Jefferson would have said if Jefferson were unbelievably inarticulate. So what does rural America actually look like? This is so I'm trying to write this book, and as I said, I'm digging through these sources, and I'm not finding what I thought I was going to find. So where does this leave me? Well, the first thing I would want to say is that One of the, I think, the problems we have when we talk about this is that we talk about it in the singular, rural America, when in fact, we ought to be talking about it in the plural, because there are lots of different kinds of rural America. That's Illinois. That's a cornfield in Illinois. That's one kind of rural. That's a played-out coal mine in West Virginia. That's a very different kind of rural. And that's the Rosebud Sioux Reservation in South Dakota, a third kind of rural. And I could throw up image after image after image to illustrate that rural northern Maine looks a lot different than rural Louisiana. And not just looks different, right, but is shaped by a different history, a different set of economic forces, and so on and so forth. So that's, I guess maybe that's my first piece of advice here, is that we stop using the singular and start using the plural, or at least make distinctions and recognize that rural America is not all white. It is not just cornfields. There's lots of other things that are going on out there. But what I decided I should do is to look at rural America sort of in like 180 degrees from the other direction. Let's assume for a moment that rural America has been shaped by and has in turn shaped all of the major forces that have shaped the country as a whole in the modern period, from the middle of the 19th century forward. What does rural America look like if we use those lenses? And so for me, I now want to roll through what it is I see as the major forces that have shaped American life since the 19th century and the way in which they have interacted with what we would call rural. The first of these is the military, the militarization of American society. The first thing to notice here is that when Europeans show up on this continent, what they see, and you see this in 17th, 18th, 19th century writing, what they look at, they call a wilderness. And to turn wilderness, which is wild and dangerous, it's full of bears and moose, to turn it into something rural with its connotations of pastoral, idyllic, domesticated, that's a military project. One historian has counted that between 1790 and 1890, 1,600 different military encounters took place between federal troops and indigenous people. I'm not real good at math, but 1,600 over a century is 160 a year, which is 3 a week on average. The process of clearing the space, the wilderness, in order that it can be rural in the first place, is a military project. I spent some time, anybody recognize that acronym? USACE? The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Well done, full marks. This turns out, this is, I could go on at great length. I'm gonna not go on at great length. But the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was in some ways the most fascinating thing I knew nothing about when I was working on this project. It proudly dates itself before the United States. It dates itself to 1774. It is why West Point was created in the early 19th century, to crank out engineers. And the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers exists, it's like this enormous octopus that can't ever be nailed down. And I tried to get, research materials and so forth. And what I discovered, and I'm going to generalize very broadly, is that in the 19th century, what the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers did was to reshape the flow of water. It dug canals. It straightened rivers. It dredged rivers. It widened harbors, all of which to stimulate commerce and economic activity, largely in rural areas. In the 20th century, what it does primarily is to dam up the water, to build dams, reservoirs, artificial lakes, hydro projects, and so forth. All of which is to say that by my best, and it's back of the envelope estimate, there isn't a single watershed in the continental United States that hasn't been altered by some Army Corps of Engineer project. That's how extensive and pervasive this work has been over 2 centuries, and again, it has reshaped. We look at look at the reservoir, look at the dam, right? All of this has reshaped rural spaces in profound ways. Irrigation projects, flood control projects, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. In the 20th century in particular, rural communities have been home to a variety of well, the military has lots of different words for it, but let's just call them bases of one kind and another, and all of those bases in turn generate economic activity for the local economy. The contractors, the caterers, all that sort of stuff that goes on. Taken together, the footprint of U.S. military installations in the continental United States equals an area approximately the size of the state of Kentucky. And all of these bases are located, or almost all of them, located in urban places. The image I'm showing you here, and it's taken with a fisheye lens, just to give you a slightly better sense of it, is the White Sands, New Mexico missile testing range. 3.5 million acres, which makes it 50% larger than the largest national park in the continental United States. That's the scale of all of this, right? And as I've said, right, the age of Indian warfare here leaves across, especially the trans-Mississippi West, a whole series of military forts, which turn into cities and towns across places like Kansas and Nebraska and Texas, which make life out there in the great agricultural heartland possible in the first place. Without the military, there is none of this that goes on. I just have to pause over this wonderful bit of American advertising, because this is the commemorative print of the 1876 Battle of the Little Bighorn, Custer's last stand. And if you can see it there in the slide, Custer is in the very middle of that, almost Christ-like, about to be slaughtered. Now, this is entirely fictitious, because no white person was actually there who recorded these images, right? So this is invented out of whole cloth by an engraver back in New York. But what you're noticing is that it was printed up, it was commissioned by Anheuser-Busch. And if you ran a bar and were going to sell Anheuser-Busch products, the salesman would give you a complimentary poster and you'd hang it up behind the bar for your patrons to look at. So generations of men sipping very bad beer, that's their image of the conquest of the West. It's true here as well. You know, Maine is not necessarily part of the great westward conquest of the United States, but littered with military installations going back to the 18th century at least, which make life in the wilderness possible in the first place. And I almost wrote a chapter about this place, which again, many of you I suspect are familiar with, up in, is it Aroostook County? Was that close? Was that even close? Yeah, all right, good. The county, good. So this is, I think, the Loring Air Force Base is, I think, a really terrific example of the kind of, let's call it an addiction that rural places develop to military spending. It's a big empty county up there. When the Air Force decides to put in an Air Force base there as part of the Cold War projection of military power, the local economy booms because people are coming in and money is coming in and enrollment in the schools go up and all the rest of it. And then, of course, It's closed during the first base reassignment and realignment phase that happened in the 1990s. And when the base closed, the people all left, and the economy suffered as a consequence. And this is true everywhere in rural America attached to a military base. If it's there, we have an economy. If it's not, we don't. The second force I wanted to look at is industrialization. And when you say industrialization and rural in the same sentence, a lot of people get a kind of cognitive dissonance there, right? Because we imagine the rural as the opposite of the industrial. But in fact, rural America has industrialized in all kinds of ways from the very beginning. Agriculture, which we think of again as that sort of pastoral pursuit, is furiously taking advantage of new kinds of industrial technologies to put to work out there on the farm. My favorite little factoid about this that I tell my students is that in 1865, at the end of the Civil War, it took 61 hours of labor to produce an acre of wheat. And by the 1890s, it took 3 hours of labor. And that's all because of the kinds of technologies coming out of, say, the McCormick factory in Chicago. Industrial technologies industrializing agricultural production. The quote you see there from the 1920s was actually an advertising campaign run by International Harvester, the maker of these instruments, right? This is the goal: turn every farm into a factory, large scale, mass production, economies of scale, and so on and so forth, exactly like an automobile factory, except we're producing corn or wheat. And then the second piece of the way we should think about industry and rural together is that really starting in the 1930s, there has been a concerted effort to move industrial production out into the cornfields, and I guess up here the potato fields. But this starts in the 30s and it continues across administrations, and continues to this day. When you have all this industrial technology out there on the farm, you need fewer and fewer people. And this became obvious in the early 20th century. How are we going to keep those boys down on the farm when they're not needed as farm labor and they want to move to Chicago or Detroit to get a job in a factory? Well, the answer seemed obvious to people at the time was to move the factories out into the countryside. That way they won't have to move to Chicago and they can have their jobs and stay in their small towns. And I can summarize this movement, which again starts in the 1930s and continues to this day. Who here drives a Honda? A couple of you drive a Honda. That's probably where it was made. The Marysville, Ohio assembly plant is Honda's first and largest facility in the United States. It was built smack dab in the middle of Ohio in 1979, 1980. It's now, as you can see, enormous, but if you look around the edges of that picture, you will see that it is in the middle of the cornfields, deliberately. This is what Honda wanted to do. Honda, in turn, in Ohio, has created a set of satellite production facilities. This is the assembly plant. So the engines and other things are made elsewhere, also in small towns, rural places, unincorporated locales, and then the pieces are fed in here to Marysville, where the whole thing is put together. The engine for your Honda was probably made in a factory in a town called Anna, which has about 1,500 residents, which means that more people go to work in that plant every day than live in that town. And that's, again, the automobile industry is, I think, a really good example of how we have made industrial production rural. It hasn't actually all gone to Mexico. A lot of it has moved out into the countryside. The third thing I looked at was big corporations, which I think, are a kind of inescapable force of American life and since the 19th century. And I think one of the things I discovered was that rural people have always been connected to large-scale national and in some cases international corporations. Rural farmers are thick in the finance economy. They are you remember in 2007 when the economy imploded and we all learned about securitized mortgages? Remember all of that? Yeah. The very first mortgaged-backed securities were put together with Midwestern farm mortgages in the 19th century. These guys want to play with the banks. And when they get angry, it's because the banks aren't giving them enough money. It's not as if they are separate somehow from the world of Wall Street or, in this case, San Francisco banks. They want in on all of this because they are expansive capitalists just like the rest of Americans at the time. I chose to study rural retail. And what I looked at first was the old Woolworths stores, which many of you remember. Woolworths made its empire, built its empire in small farm towns, starting in New York State and then spreading through the Midwest and even into the South. Woolworths, they always reported the best day of sales at Woolworths was on a Saturday when all the farm families would come in. And by the time Woolworths has stores all over the country, what it's doing is bringing products, consumer goods, manufactured in Chicago and in Philadelphia, in London, manufactured in Paris, and moving them out to Ames, Iowa. So that rural people are absolutely connected with a global world of consumer goods and retail shopping. And that's been true since the late 19th century. Woolworths, as you know, has seen better days and has had a very rough go of it. So the other thing I looked at was sort of, let's call it Woolworths 2.0, Dollar General. We all know about Walmart. We all know about the Walmart economy, and I chose not to dig into that because others have, but I was really fascinated by Dollar General. Actually, in all honesty, it was my wife who was really fascinated by Dollar General, and she said, you really need to write something about that. So I did, because I'm not as dumb as I look. There are about 3,500 Walmart stores across the country, which is a large number. There are maybe 18,000 Dollar Generals. And I say maybe because trying to look at Dollar General, it becomes like a Heisenberg uncertainty problem. By the time you count them all, many of them have closed and new ones have opened. And they're very proud of the fact that they can close a store or open a store in 24 hours. That's how fast they get in and out of these communities. Dollar General starts in a small town in Kentucky, spreads through the South, and this is in the 1930s. By the 1980s, they've moved into the Midwest, and by the turn of the 21st century, they're ubiquitous. If you were to stick 18,000 pins in a map of where every Dollar General store is located, you would see that they are almost entirely located in rural areas, small towns and rural areas, and it would be an almost perfect map of American poverty, because that's their model. It's not Woolworth's model was to be a center of a community, a lunch counter where you would go and meet your friends for an ice cream. Dollar General's model is parasitic, and it's to operate in places where nobody can afford anything else. One of Dollar General's CEOs said, "Our customers can't afford Walmart," and so. This is an extraordinary development that I tried to explore a little bit, but I do think, as I said, large-scale corporations, national, international corporations are absolutely at the center of rural experience then and today. And the final force I looked at, and this is particularly true of the post-war American period, is suburbanization. The single biggest threat to rural land comes from real estate developers. And we have a kind of model now, or we had a model where suburbs grow sort of concentrically out from a central city. That's not true anymore. Now what you have are suburban-style developments that can pop up anywhere, anywhere there's road access. And so all through the Midwest, you can drive through these areas, and what you'll see is acreage for sale. 3-acre lots, willing to subdivide. That's what's happening here. And so I wanted to look at the way in which the suburbanization of the United States was both affected, but was also shaped by rural experience. Okay, and what about the role of the federal government, if that's part of our rural ideology? Well, in fact, as many of you probably know, the federal government has disproportionately invested in all kinds of ways in rural areas, even as rural people denounce the federal government. The title of the slide here is taken from the phrase here in the slide is taken from the title of the first biography ever written of Franklin Roosevelt. He was a country squire. He was one of those people who really just didn't like American cities and thought Americans would be better off back on the farm. And much of the New Deal, indeed a majority of the New Deal when we think about it, is actually targeted at trying to save rural America. I could go on with a long list of those, but I'm only going to give you two. The first of these is the Rural Electrification Administration, which gets underway in 1936, and it responds to a private sector failure. I know if there are any economists in the room, that's going to make you angry, but yeah, the private sector failed. In 1936, more than 90% of rural households had no electricity, which meant that they're still using lamps or candles or whatever it happens to be. In steps, because power companies aren't going to spend the money to string the cables and the lines out to these far-flung houses across these big spaces. There's no profit in that. What the Rural Electrification Administration was essentially to set up electricity co-ops, including here in Maine. There are still a few left over in Maine from the New Deal, so that now cooperatively we can get these houses wired into the grid. And by 1960, 25 years, give or take, more than 90% of rural households now have electricity. And these co-ops still function for millions of American homes, right? But rural places, because again, private companies weren't going to do this. Many rural people referred to this as at the time as the night the lights came on. It was life-changing in the most basic way. And they tell these stories of the time they first flip a switch and electricity comes into the house and the night isn't dark anymore. The second thing I'll just mention by way of the New Deal is the TVA, which in some ways was the largest, most comprehensive New Deal program. And you can see on the map there what the region of the Tennessee River watershed looks like. It reaches all the way up into southwestern Virginia, down into northern Georgia. There's Tennessee and the top of Alabama as well. What the TVA did was two things. First, well, it built a lot of dams, and the dams were designed to control the flooding which had been made worse because so much of that area had been clear-cut and had eroded very badly. But most of those dams generate hydropower. And so here was the Roosevelt administration's promise to industry. Come out here, set up your factory here, you get cheap electricity. And that will be much better than having a factory in Detroit or Cleveland or wherever it happens to be. So the New Deal, and I'm quoting here a scholar from Yale University from 1940, the rugged individualists have become the principal beneficiaries of government support. The farmer asked and received economic aid on an unprecedented scale, and the Jeffersonian ideal has been translated into policy. There it is, right? We've decided that rather than kind of reckon with a metropolitan, urbanized society, we're going to wrench our policy around to support the yeoman Jeffersonian ideal. William Faulkner, himself a child of rural Mississippi, put this more bluntly. In 1956, our economy is the federal government. And so there it is, right? Standing against that ideology that we continue to hear, the federal government is intimately involved in rural experience at every single level. Now, let me circle back to that mythology. Let me come back to Ma and Pa Wilder here, because these books were written, 1932 is not an accident when that book first came out. Laura Ingalls Wilder and her daughter, Rose Wilder, deeply, deeply angered by the New Deal, deeply opposed to Franklin Roosevelt, and wrote these books as an antidote, as a protest against the New Deal, expressing a nostalgia, really, for a past that never existed. And what I mean by that is to say, the Ingalls family homesteads first in Mankato, near Mankato, Minnesota. Two things to just note about that right off the bat. First, homesteads. Homestead Act, the greatest socialist land redistribution project in human history. Federal government giving away this land for free. The second thing is Mankato is now available for homesteading because the federal government had just concluded the Sioux War of 1863, still the largest mass execution in American history, signed off by President Abraham Lincoln. So right away, right, the whole story of Little House is built on these federal policies. But of course, it turns out Pa is a terrible farmer. And so the family just bounces around the Midwest. They're in Missouri for a while. They're in Iowa. They actually wind up illegally homesteading on what was then Indian reservation land in Kansas, and they have to get tossed out of that. But as you read the books as a whole, and here I'm quoting scholar Penny Linsenmeyer, this is Laura Ingalls Wilder depicts her family as being victimized over and over again by the federal government. That's why Pa fails, because the federal government won't let him do what he really needs to do. So, as I said, we double down on this nostalgia. It remains a central part of our understanding and our mythology, and that's what I became really fascinated by. So at the end of the day, you know, is rural America left behind? I don't think so. I think rural America has been at the center of American development just like the rest of the country. And I'll offer a couple of final thoughts here. I think part of what we are seeing, when we see anger and grievance and dissatisfaction coming out of certain parts of rural America, remember plural, not singular, right? Lots of different kinds of rural, but when we see that, I think what we're seeing is a disconnect between the mythology of yeoman farmers, virtuous citizens, wholesomeness and whatnot, and the reality of rural experience. And in fact, we have freighted that rural mythology so heavily that it's almost inevitably going to be a disappointment, real life. It's never going to live up to that Jeffersonian ideal. And I think that helps explain, again, why we see this anger and this grievance. Now, as a historian, I am asked when I've talked about this, well, okay, so what's the answer here? What should we do for the future? And I try to explain very carefully that I deal with the past. I have a hard enough time with the past, and the future really isn't, it's not something I'm good at. I'm better than most economists, but I just don't get paid as much. But I now feel obligated to say something about this, and so I will. And I want to go back to the 1980s. In the 1980s, urban America, especially the older parts of urban America, and rural America found themselves, oddly, in the same place. New York City was going bankrupt, so was Philadelphia. Disinvestment, violence, arson, all of that stuff. There's the South Bronx on the left-hand side of the slide. Meanwhile, especially in the middle part of the country, especially in the row crop part of America, farm crisis, the farm crisis. This is when Willie Nelson invents the Farm Aid concert, fundraising concert, 1985. The difference, however, so here's a moment when rural America and urban America find themselves facing many of the same challenges for many of the same reasons. It's the 1980s economy. The difference, however, is that at that moment in the 1980s, a collection of architects, planners, designers, thinkers came together to reimagine, to reinvent what the American city might look like. And it sort of formalized itself in 1993 in the Congress of New Urbanism. And I've got a long quote from their webpage there about how we rebuild American cities to make them work better. And I think, grossly overstated here, but it has been successful. The image you see on the left is Cincinnati through a section of a town called the Over the Rhine area, and it was in the 1980s abandoned. And on the right is a farmer's market in Brooklyn, so crowded there, no, the old Yogi Berra line. Nobody goes there anymore because it's too crowded. I would note, and I dug this up as I was preparing for this talk, that the 2030 plan for the city of Portland draws on all kinds of new urbanist principles, shaping them for this, its own particularities, obviously. But even here, right, we see the impacts of this urban renaissance, which started percolating in the 1980s and early 1990s. That has not happened in rural America. There is really, or at least to my knowledge, no positive, proactive vision of what a rural future might look like in the way that there has been for urban America. What we're left with, therefore, is a nostalgia for the way things used to be, and a nostalgia which, again, in some quarters, has grown increasingly toxic. So I'll end with that.